Hello, this is Mitchell Stevens. I'm a co-convener of the Learning Society Project, and I am joining you today from just outside Washington, D.C., at the Rosslyn, Virginia campus of the UVA Darden School of Business, which I'm mentioning because I'm at a conference essentially called Learning at Work. And the theme of the entire conversation is how universities and large employers in the public and private sector um, can work together around skills-based learning projects. So very much embodying and the kinds of conversations that we've been carrying out under the banner of the Learning Society. And I'm sure I'm not alone on people in the call who are sensing just how much energy and enthusiasm there is in this domain about sort of um, organizing our thinking and policy and entrepreneurial work around learning opportunities that are oriented around skills rather than credentials. And I'm coming to think that this may, in fact, be a kind of watershed year for these kinds of conversations. All the more reason to stay in touch with each other through these forums. I'm delighted to have with us today Kathy Booth and Rebecca Hanson, who you know about because you registered for the webinar and you have a sense of who they are. I'm going to let them talk about their work and expertise. All I will say is another frame that many of us bring to these conversations is a shared understanding that legacy colleges and universities are increasingly asking themselves and are being asked to rethink their instructional offerings around skills rather than degrees. Um, an interesting and important and even noble idea, but also very challenging. And Rebecca and Kathy are among the people nationwide who are facing that challenge head on and have some very useful and complementary insights on that. So with that, I'll turn it over first to Kathy. And you'll be hearing, we'll be structuring this dialogue a little bit differently than the prior ones, in which Rebecca, Kathy, and Mitchell will be passing the baton between us over the course of the hour, and we'll also be specifically making times throughout the hour to receive your comments and questions. So, please be ready for those moments. And also, in the spirit of getting to know each other, if you're willing to just put your name and your affiliation or some other link about yourself in the chat, we can get to know each other a little bit that way. And with that, I'll turn it over to Kathy.
Thank you so much, Mitchell. So I'm Kathy Booth, and I help to lead WestEd's Center for Economic Mobility. So we basically build partnerships between educational institutions, workforce entities, and employers to create pathways to better wages. And a lot of my work has been done with particularly community colleges and helping them understand what the outcomes are for their former students and how that relates to the broader labor market. So when we talk about this idea that colleges need to be more focused on skills, it's really community colleges that have been leading in this space. But it's important to know something about what it's like to be on the ground trying to do this work. And that is that most people who work in colleges don't have any information about the economic outcomes of their former students. While there are some longitudinal data systems that make this information available, it often doesn't make its way back to folks that are making decisions about programs. And even though there are now tools like the College Scorecard federally that does provide this information, a lot of people just don't know about it and don't know how to use it. So, as it so happened, about a decade ago, I worked with the California Community College's Chancellor's Office to build a very user-friendly data tool that was intended for practitioners on the ground to understand the economic outcomes of their students. So we had every single one of the 116 colleges and every program that those colleges offered, and this beautiful dashboard where you could quickly go in and understand what had happened to your students. And I spent about 5 years crisscrossing the state answering questions. And what surprised me is that people just didn't believe the data. they didn't believe the numbers about how little people were making. And as I dug in to try to understand why they didn't believe the information, I realized that they didn't understand that our labor market had restructured in a way that created a very different reality for their students. So when I try to explain what's happened to our economy, I sometimes use this visual. And this is true for pretty much every labor market across the country. So on one side of the economy, you have a large number of low-wage jobs that require very little education, but there are also a lot of ways in which those jobs are difficult to have. So they're often part-time. You don't know what your schedule is going to be. You know, Kristen Harknett did a previous session describing this reality in the retail sector. So in addition to that, there's no benefits. And it's very, very difficult for people to have any sort of career ladder when they're over on that side. Then on the other side of our economy, we have a lot of jobs that do pay living wages, but they almost always require a bachelor's degree. And when you look in the middle, what's called middle skills jobs, meaning that's more than a high school diploma, but less than a bachelor's degree, there are fewer jobs than there used to be. But even more importantly, it's very difficult for people to make it from one side to the other. And there's a lot of reasons for that. So some of it literally has to do with the scaffolding of skills. So when you think about maybe you're working in retail and you want to make it to a supervisor position, the skills that you need are actually 21st century skills, so like communication and problem solving and teamwork and things like that, which is not generally what we teach in our short-term stackable programs. Or if you want to look at healthcare, it's really uncommon for people to make it from the entry-level positions like a home health aide or a medical assistant to the better paid positions like being a nurse, because you have to be able to pass a chemistry class, which means you have to understand algebra. And a lot of people that end up in the short-term programs never get very far in their math skills. There's other problems that make it really difficult for people to make it across this divide. So some of it has to do with those working conditions in the low paid jobs. So if you've got this incredible amount of instability and you don't make enough money, you can't save to be able to go to college. You can't figure out how to fit courses into a schedule that's always changing. And you really can't afford to take time out where you're not making money. And colleges just really aren't structured for adult learners. They're still structured, even community colleges, for the most part, for very young students whose primary job is to go to class. And that doesn't work very well for folks that are trying to fit this in around their other responsibilities. So in this challenge, one of the next things that I hear about all the time is the idea that you can go do a short-term program and be able to make a lot more money. So somehow people still believe that this is possible. So it just so happens that I did work for about a decade with a researcher named Peter Riley Barr. He used to be at the University of Michigan. He's now at the Strata Institute for the Future of Work. And we were looking for this phenomenon that we kept hearing about from faculty, which is that students would come and they would take one or two classes that were mid-career, and then they'd go get better jobs. But nobody believed them because
Mhm.
this was the completion agenda moment. So we went into the
Mhm.
data. We discovered that sure enough, there's a lot of these students. And so we coined the term skills builder to sort of make it clear that this was an actual thing that community colleges do. About 1 in 7 colleges, or so students that are going into community college for the first time fit the skills builder course taking pattern. And we found this across multiple states. We were in California and Michigan and Ohio and Colorado. And we did analyses during different points of the economic cycle. So we started right after the Great Recession. We were looking in the boom years, and the numbers were strikingly similar. So when you look at this chart that's on the screen, this is what we found when we looked across the various states. So basically what you see are people that are already in the workplace. And then there's something that happens where either their jobs are stagnating or they're actually losing wages. And then they come and take that one or two classes, and all of a sudden their earnings bounce back up again. So I've got a link on the screen for our analyses. We've come up with simple methodologies that people at colleges can do to find the skills builder courses in their curriculum so that they can work better with those students. So this seems like it would be really good news. And when Peter and I were first going out, we were saying, hey, completion is not the only thing we should be looking at for success. But then we realized that people were having unrealistic expectations about what that change in earnings actually meant for individuals. So the truth is that you're not going to make six figures after you take a couple of classes. And what's weird is that I hear this all the time. People are like, "Oh, I know about this program, and you're just there like for a semester, and then you make this great money." And I am always asking them, what is this program? Because I haven't found it in most of my analyses, with the exception of a couple of things like petroleum technology, where you're like climbing around in
Mhm.
an oil rig. And so what we find when we really look at the data is what's showing on this pie chart. So basically, it is true that most people who do skills building, course taking, do better. They end up with more money in their pocket. But on average, they're making about $5,000 more a year.
Mhm.
Then there's a chunk of people that are actually doing well, but they were already doing well when they came to take those classes. They were already making a living wage, and then they do a little bit better. And so many of those people actually already have bachelor's degrees. So these are
Mhm.
not people where this is their only training. And they're often in disciplines like construction and policing that are unionized, where what's actually happening is they're taking courses that are linked to the union scale for increased earnings. So it is not the courses alone that are having that result. We also see a number of people that don't make any more money, and they may be doing that skills building to be able to keep a current job. But some of the disciplines where you would think that this would really help, like IT, does not demonstrate that people make more money. And so there are a very small number of people that are moving up an economic rung, but generally those are highly, highly targeted programs that people are participating in. So the idea that you can just like make it from 0 to 6 figures in just a couple of months is not borne out in the evidence. And then the last myth I want to bust is this idea of stackable credentials. So the visual on the screen comes from the Perkins Collaborative, and it's been shown for years and years and years. I've been in so many conversations where colleges talk so hopefully about the ability to allow people to come and do a short-term program and work for a while and come back and make their way up the ladder. But unfortunately, the evidence shows that this does not happen. That generally, when people stack, they actually get all of those credentials at the same time, which is basically that they've participated in a modular curriculum. Or that people tend to get multiple credentials for jobs that pay about the same amount. So they're not going vertically as they're stacking, they're just broadening their skill set. So this could be something like you can do phlebotomy, draw blood, and you can run an EKG machine, but that doesn't get you to a better job. We also see disturbingly that low income students tend to go into fields that are stackable, but that don't pay well. So, for example, they're in early childhood education, which is a chronically underfunded field, even though it's absolutely critical to our economy. And the pathway that I hear about the most is this pathway from home health aide to nurse. And unfortunately, the data show that that is not a pathway that very many people follow. That what happens is they get stuck in the lower end jobs. And that goes back to things like the ability to do math, which is what is required as you move on, and the
Mhm.
difficulty with the chaotic schedules that particularly home health aides have to be able to enroll full time to get to a nursing program, which is often there's a long wait list for. So this is sort of giving you a sense of what we know from the research. So I'm going to turn it over to Rebecca, and she's going to describe a little bit more what this is like in practice working with employers and with union members.
Thank you so much, Kathy, and good morning. I'm Rebecca Hanson. I'm the Executive Director of the SEIU UHW Education Fund. We are a multi-employer labor management training fund working across 23 hospital and health system employers on the West Coast. I'm going to share a little bit about our industry perspective. Just on your point, Kathy, I think pictured here is our emergency department tech phlebotomy training we did actually in Portland, Oregon, in partnership with a community college. And it's a stackable credential of phlebotomy that allows a worker to go from ED Tech 1 to ED Tech 2. These are sort of like, incremental gains. And we certainly do sometimes support those larger mobility opportunities, but they take years, right, to happen. So just I'll give you a little bit of a sense of what's happening in our industry. There's several sort of underlying trends that are driving a large and growing need for healthcare workers. One is the aging population, the silver tsunami that we all hear about, which is also impacting healthcare worker retirement. And also, since the pandemic, we've seen a much higher rate of exit or plans to exit. And there's a link there to an article about that. There's also a lack of affordable and quality education opportunities for those moving into healthcare. And as Kathy highlighted, limited career pathways. So 60 to 80% of allied health programs are uh, leaving graduates with high debt burdens because they're for-profit programs. And when we've done the analysis of how many medical assistants or other entry-level careers have career mobility, it's only 10%. So it's the exception, not the rule. And it's a really exceptional person who can overcome all those barriers that Kathy cited. Overall, when you look at the data of graduates, there's a declining supply of allied health graduates, which has been
Mm,
noted as a huge issue for the industry going forward. But also, once people do graduate, they lack the experience and skills to be job ready. And you hear from employers all the time that people aren't just ready to hit the ground; they need a lot more training. And as a result, it's really common for employers to require experience. So new grads have a hard time then overcoming that barrier into hire because they don't have the right experience requirement for that job. And then overall, there's regional supply gaps. So even when it looks like there's an oversupply in some areas and occupations, when you start to break it down regional, you really find some big gaps between in a certain market, what the jobs are and what the graduates are to fill those jobs. So overall, and I saw somebody in the chat is here talking about AI. I just want to say that I think on top of all of this and the complications of changes in federal funding right now for healthcare industry, there's also just an enormous shift happening around technology. This has always been true for all our industries, but
mm,
it's especially true right now. Every conversation we have with our union and employer partners focuses on AI shifts and automation, how occupations are going to change moving forward. And so it's essential that this information gets fed back into how we think about training and education in our industry. I'll pass it back to Kathy.
Actually, I think
Oh,
we're passing
Mitchell,
it to
sorry.
Mitchell.
Yeah.
ah, yeah. And this is also a great time to get some questions or comments from the other attendees. You can use either the Q&A, or the chat function. I mean, I think it's worth remembering that, all the way through the end of the second Obama administration, right? There was near unanimity in policy circles about the so-called, oh, Kathy mentioned it before, the so-called completion agenda, right? That the way in which the vast majority of policymakers and philanthropies were talking about social mobility was really around completion of four-year bachelor's degrees, and so it's really been fairly recently that we've been sort of thinking about getting that Titanic to turn. And perhaps especially true in many ways at community colleges, which have been asked to do so many things for so many different parties for quite a while. And so um, one of the reasons I think it's, important to keep accumulating the evidence that Kathy and Rebecca are talking about is to make it really vivid, as clear as possible, sort of why we need a new way of thinking about um, talent investment, right?
Yeah.
Um, and not to do this in a way that punishes schools, right, for the change in the rules of the game, but also finding ways to encourage the kind of movement that it certainly seems our national human capital system needs. Others?
While we're waiting on questions, I do want to sort of point out the conundrum we're in. So the emphasis
Mhm.
on bachelor's degrees was evidence-based. I mean, that's where the better
Mm,
paid jobs were. And I think our challenge
right.
is that we are now in a place where there's a lot of jobs that need to be filled, and there's a lot of people who have skills that are related, but the odds that they're going to go all the way back to get a bachelor's degree if they are in
Mhm,
their 40s or 50s is almost zero. And so,
mhm,
because we have people that are living and working longer, we really have to be much more creative about the ways that we allow people to demonstrate their skills or fill in the missing skills that would allow them to get to better paid jobs.
mhm, mhm, mhm. Yeah, and I think another piece of this that I feel like our conversation might be able to inform is, you know, much a one hears a great deal about moving to skills-based hiring and skills scaffolding and skill latticing, but we tend to not recognize that the life course of workers, right? So people who are in their, 40s and 50s have a different relationship to legacy schooling in general, right? And also to have a very different sort of life responsibilities and orientations than people in their teens and 20s and 30s, and sort of recognizing that we probably need different kinds of learning opportunities for people at different life stages who have had very different experiences with legacy
Yeah.
schooling is also an important way in which this conversation needs to be complicated. I hear from a couple here, Rajinder Gill, and forgive my likely mispronunciation of your name, writes, what are some solutions colleges have piloted to this challenge around building skills that don't equate to debt and do equate to high-end employment? So some bright spots. And then Moises Bernal Puentes asks, there's lots of talk about giving workers credit for lived or work experience, right? Credit for prior learning, as our colleagues at Kale call it. Could you talk about that as well? So bright spots and credit for prior learning.
So the last third of the presentation will give you two very specific examples of some bright spots related to that.
Oh,
Um, I
great.
think I think for credit for prior learning, this is a very important point to focus on. So the model that we have right now for credit for prior learning uses the college course as the foundational unit. So what
Mm,
happens is that what you know gets compared to what's being taught within the curriculum. So this can be a challenge. So for example, for folks that served in the military, they might be trying to get like an advanced critical thinking course through that, but because they might have the name of the theory for something related to critical thinking, the feeling is that we can't translate their lived experience at work into academic credit. So I think that there's other models like competency-based education, which is basically saying, what are the things you really have to know to be able to do a job or to be considered someone who's really competent in a particular area? And that when you flip that paradigm, it becomes much easier to document what's known through work. So here's a really good example. I have absolutely no formal training in building large data systems, but I've helped to design some of the largest systems in the country. I don't know how to get credit for prior learning for the fact that I know how to build a data system. There's just
wait
not
a minute,
places in it.
Kathy, you didn't take a class in that?
I did not.
I'm going to tell the governor.
All right, so I'm going to move us on to our next section because I
Okay.
think this is going to be important for how we think about solving the problem. So one of the things that I would like to think when there's a problem, like let's get some more information that would help people make a decision. So community college practitioners are just incredible human beings. They are so focused on trying to get their students to a better life. But the issue is that when we're giving them information to understand what they should be teaching people related to jobs, the model is two-dimensional. So basically, every single supply and demand report that gets created across the country basically says, what are the academic awards? How many people have earned those particular credentials? And how many job openings are there? And then you do the comparison to say, oh, there's a gap. But this does not work for a whole bunch of reasons. So the first one is that sometimes that credential is actually a stepping stone to a job that's going to require more training. So a really good example of this is that across the country, the most common community college award is an associate's degree in general studies, which there is no labor market demand for. But
Mhm.
it is an excellent set of skills if you're going to become a K through 8 educator. And there are lots of teaching jobs and they pay living wages in every part of the country, but that's not included in these calculations. The second issue is that people don't always go into the field that's related to their job. So I go around the country and I talk to educators about labor market data. And the first question that I ask people is what was their major? And it's not the whole room raising their hands for education. People have had all sorts of different types of majors. So it's a false idea that the name of the program is directly related to the job that you get. The third problem is that increasingly we're offering training in other venues that are not included in these calculations. So even like non-credit community college programs are not included in those supply and demand models. You're not going to be seeing things that are coming from all these new modular and online trainings that are really valuable, but they're not included in this equation. The fourth issue, and this is related to what you were raising, Mitchell, is that people are living and working longer. So maybe you've got a degree in one topic, but you've built skills over time and you would be an excellent candidate for a job, but we've got no way to document that there's all these people that have those skills. And the final issue is if we are going to get to this place of, skills first hiring where employers are not looking at your academic credential as the primary way they're sorting people that are eligible to hire, this is going to be less and less important as we're trying to look at it. So given that people are being given information that doesn't really get at the skills question, we have to come up with a different model. So what we need is a three-dimensional model. So on one side are the people in your community and the skills that they already have. On the other are the jobs and the skills that are actually required. And the third part, you might think those are your programs, whether that's offered by an academic institution or a workforce system, but it's not. The third leg of this stool is the partnership that has to be built between education, workforce, and employers if you want to be able to bridge those skills gaps. Because it's not enough just to teach somebody a discrete skill. As Rebecca was explaining, people aren't able to get jobs if they don't have experience. And so two of the best ways to be able to get a job after you've earned a credential is that you either know someone already and you're building on social capital, or you've done some sort of work-based learning, so you've had some real experience and maybe an employer has met you. And as we get into this AI, whatever, hiring war where AI is writing your resume and AI is screening the resumes of applicants, the idea that you're going to have some sort of personal connection is probably going to become even more important for being able to get your foot in the door for those jobs. So one of the things that I want to do then is to explain why this is so difficult for community colleges, and that is that they don't have information that is formatted in that way. So I am a huge fan here in California of the Centers of Excellence for Labor Market Research. So what happens is in 9 regions, there are these groups of excellent researchers, and what they do is they pull data that is specific to what colleges need related to supply and demand, and colleges work with them when they are designing new programs or revamping programs. So like really California has more data than just about anybody else, but it still isn't sufficient. So here I want you to take a look down at the very bottom row. This is a report that I actually pulled off the Centers of Excellence website, and it's showing you that there were 2 graduates in medical office technology, but there were more than 1,000 medical secretary jobs. So if I were a reasonable community college, dean, I'd say maybe we should start a medical office technology program. But the truth is that there's other ways that you can build the skills necessary for that job. So if you were a medical assistant or even an administrative assistant, you might have a lot of the skills that were needed. So what might be interesting would be for the college to say, how do we talk to people in our administrative assistant program and tell them they could go into medical office technology? Or how do we go back to folks that graduated from our medical assisting program and make sure they have the additional specific skills that allow them to do medical office technology? And this would be a very, very different way to think about how to use labor market information and put skills at the center of how you would make decisions. The other problem that we have is that as we're beginning to blend where people get training, so maybe some trainings are offered by a community college and some through a workforce system and some through community-based organizations, we have a problem in that we cannot talk about these concepts in any consistent way. So I'm pulling some information here from a report that has to do with the South Central Coast region of California. So we've got a couple of problems. So one is that one of the biggest biggest programs in that area is College of the Canyons. And in other contexts, like in the workforce system, that college is considered to be part of the Los Angeles system and not the Central Coast. Another issue is that we're looking at information related to digital commerce. And under some frameworks, that's going to show up as an arts, media, and design program. And in others, it's going to show up as an IT program. So then you're bifurcating that way. And then if you even want to be able to describe what the programs are, there are different taxonomies used in K-12, community college, and 4-year institutions right now. So your poor labor market expert is like trying to pull all this together in a coherent way. And they're going out and they're talking to faculty and they're like, well, I got this report from the Jobs First Collaborative and it said that actually we needed to do a different thing. And then there's another report that came out of the K-16 regional partnerships. And what happens is everybody ends up arguing about methodology and not looking at the data. And so when you're already showing people, that makes them uncomfortable, because it's saying people are not able to stack credentials and they're not getting to living wage jobs, that despite the fact that everyone is working so hard to get to that better life, that it is not working. It is so much easier to argue about methodology than it is to engage what has to change about the systems. So I'm going to pass it back to Rebecca, who's going to talk a little bit about what this looks like on the ground.
Thank you so much, Kathy. So just to bring it back to the industry perspective, I think all the challenges Kathy said for the system are so intense and real. And then from the industry's perspective, both from the learner perspective and from the employer perspective, there's just a lack of awareness of what those programs are that are available in the area. Many of the programs, like I mentioned earlier, are very expensive. So they're prohibitive especially for entry-level workers who may already have debt from their first certificate or training that got them into their job. There's very little connection for a lot of those programs. I saw somebody put in the chat, like, what about online learning? One of the challenges of that in healthcare is there's often a lack of connection to clinical training that needs to accompany that classroom work, and that there's a lot of confusion about what the career pathways are, as Kathy described. So there's, what is this job? What training is needed? What does it lead to? What are the next things I can do after I complete that? And then once a learner actually gets into a program, overcoming those hurdles, there's often a lack of academic support. It's hard for working adults. They may have not been in school for a while, or also the schedule doesn't work for them. There's once they complete, there's low job search support. There's barriers of the work experience we already talked about, and employers really emphasize the fact that graduates are not work ready, that they don't have the skills that they need, that those haven't yet been gained through this education, that they got technical education, but they didn't get the other skills that they need to be successful in the workplace. So like we really have doubled down with our partners to try to think about what are the ways that we can design ourselves out of these challenges. And so for the SAU Training Fund, that includes really doing robust recruitment strategy that informs and prepares learners. We do this both with employers and managers and with the learners themselves, hosting info sessions, really getting deep with them on understanding what is this program, what could it lead to, what are my next steps once I complete it, that you go in really understanding what it is you're signing up for, that the programs are fully covered. And somebody mentioned this, I think Rajinder mentioned this, but that we want to build in credit for prior learning, prior experience, and this is really what we're trying to work with the colleges, employers to develop those. It also includes having the flexible schedules and modalities that make it easier for working adults to attend the program. We want to have prearranged clinicals, so we don't want our learners going into programs that are online without a clear understanding of where they're going to do clinicals. And employers will tell you they're constantly requested by people like, hey, I'm in this online nursing program. Can I do my clinicals here where I work? And it's not prearranged. And as a result, employers end up with hundreds of different clinical agreements for training. So there's really an opportunity here to get much more focused in how we prearrange those clinicals with key regional programs through the community colleges or public universities, and also building incentives that align our supervisors and preceptors to host those clinicals. It's not enough just to put somebody in a workplace and have them trail behind somebody. That person needs to be skilled and rewarded for offering those precepting hours, and the supervisor needs to be on board too, the clinical supervisor. So these are critical struggles that employers have in this time of workforce shortage to be able to host students. So this is just a really important area for designing a successful program. We also are looking at how we provide support services, both pre and post program. There's a lot of emphasis on how big of a difference this can make, that we can address people's other problems that make it possible for them to engage in education and training, whether that be transportation, tutoring, maybe a past bill they have that they need to release a transcript to get prior credit, things like that. Work experience bridges that we talked about. and really ensuring that as we design the curriculum, that we're forward thinking, looking at what are the other types of skills that they need to be ready for, what kinds of social emotional skills do they need to have to deal with how work is changing on the daily basis. Pass it back to Mitchell.
Great. So there were some earlier questions that didn't show up in my Q&A stream until a few minutes late. So I've got a great lineup of queries. Um, Here's a nice set of two. First from Deidre Peasley. How do we help employers change their perspectives on what is required for jobs and how that can be demonstrated? So how do we get employers into this conversation? And then Martha Deavy asks, who's helping workers navigate the paths, right?
Yeah.
So, right, employers, how do we get them into the conversation? And then how do we think about, helping workers, navigate this increasingly complex credential anarchy that they're facing.
I can share some thoughts on that and how we do it in healthcare. As a union labor management training fund, we do work really directly with employers to address some of these things through negotiating, right? Because we have the union, we're able to have the conversations with the employer around reducing experience barriers or even waiving them or eliminating them under certain circumstances. So, for example, if a worker is able to do their clinical hours, it sort of pairs together, right? Like we can this worker is moving from a medical assistant to a licensed vocational nurse. They're going to do their clinical hours on site, and those clinical hours are going to count towards the experience requirement for the job. So we're going to waive the 1 or 2 year experience requirement for the job. We're also able to discuss with the employer posting more level 1 jobs. In our industry, a lot of times what you see is that they'll post something called a level 2 job where you really have to have like years and years of experience to be able to qualify. So just really the negotiations around ensuring that that pathway gets opened and smoothed, that we're reducing the barriers and drag on hire. It's a process,
Mhm.
and I don't, without sort of being able to do it in a negotiation, I think it's really like, I guess if you didn't have a union, you'd have to really figure out how to get the employer to sit down and talk through what those opportunities are and how to support that process.
Mhm. Mhm.
I forget
Mhm.
There's
the
been
second
some work
question. Yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
from the U.S. Chamber of Commerce Foundation where they're talking to employers about their interest in doing hiring that's more skills focused and less degree and
Yeah.
certificate focused. And
Mhm.
what we hear from them is that people are interested, they just can't figure out how to make it work. What they need is verification that
Mhm.
people actually have those skills. So, like, it's not great for me to be like, oh, I totally know CPR. Like, they need to know that I actually know CPR. But the question is, how did
Mhm.
that information get connected to their HR systems? And
Mhm.
it's really right now nobody's job to figure this out. So, like, we
Mhm.
have this problem that nobody is holding the risk of this shift
Mhm.
in practices. And so everyone's sort of pointing to each other. So the employers are saying to the educators, well, you're not producing people that have the skills that I need. And then the
Mhm.
educators are pointing at the employers and saying, well, you're not hiring the people that we're like
Yeah.
churning out. And the poor worker who's caught in the middle is just trying to find a job.
The
And
worker is absorbing the risk,
Yeah,
right?
exactly.
that's
And
right.
that's
Right.
not going to work as our economy restructures. So if we choose to have it be millions of individuals figuring out the structural problem and negotiating on their own behalf, I just think it's going to not go very well and nobody's going to get
Yeah.
what they need.
Yeah. And there are a couple of references to European examples, specifically around apprenticeships and internships. And those examples are really important. I think it's also useful to remember that, um, the human capital systems the United States built in the middle of the 20th century is very different than the human capital system that our neighbors and many countries on the other side of the Atlantic Ocean built specifically around this risk question. So um, in Europe, that gets settled by an ongoing conversation, still ongoing conversation between corporations, organized labor, and government, who are all presumed to share some responsibility for the employability of, say, the German people. And so you have this long tradition of corporations, labor, and government working jointly on training and human capital investment. In the United States, during that same period, um, we had we did very different mechanisms. First of all, we had strong labor unions for many industrial and craft fields that did a lot of training and a lot of risk holding on behalf of workers. Um, but but union power dramatically declined in the U.S. After the 1980s. And then we put all of most of our eggs in the college basket, which is, basically your skills are yours. It's your responsibility to invest in yourself by acquiring college degrees. And now that we're in a moment in American history where we realize that the 4-year college degree actually has a bunch of problems too, we don't have the sort of organizational muscle in place, right, to replace it. And so that's where these sort of large questions come, right? What I like about Kathy's picture. It shows this sort of gap in the middle, which is we can't decide whose problem that is, essentially. And I think one of the things we're trying to do with this forum series is to sort of raise those questions about how that risk should be apportioned among government, business, and students and workers themselves. Maybe go back to you guys. Do you have some more points, or are we in open season for Q&A now? I think you had some
No,
bright
now,
spots, if I'm not
yeah,
if I'm not mistaken.
absolutely. So back to that question from earlier. So given this challenge, so like if we sort of pull all the way back, the people who are on the ground don't have information being provided to them in a way that enables them to adapt, especially in the community college level. So when Rebecca was talking about the kinds of information that they engage with when they're trying to have employers and educational institutions and learners work together better, is totally different than what we are saying we need to be giving to colleges. And it gets much closer to that 3D LMI model that I outlined. So what we're going to do is talk a little bit about a couple of projects that the California Community Colleges Chancellor's Office have been launching with unions. So one with the Ed Fund that Rebecca works with, and the other with the United Domestic Workers. And then my organization, the Center for Economic Mobility, is helping to provide the support so that we can design programs in a way that are really responsive to the needs of different communities. So the first one that I want to talk about is the United Domestic Workers Program. So what's important, first of all, is to understand what it means to be a domestic worker. So these are folks who are being paid to care for people in their own homes. So it might be an elder or a person with a disability or a very young child. And we actually have this opportunity where you can get paid while you do that work. The issue is that you are paid very, very little, that you don't have access to benefits. And so it would be beneficial for people to be able to move to a better, more stable job. And just to give you a sense of who the members of this union are, they are disproportionately down at the lower part of the state, so more in the sort of the San Diego and Imperial
Mhm.
region, LA. They are mostly women of color. They are mostly over the age of 50, and many of them do not speak English fluently. So when we stop and say, instead of like, oh, it's a union thing, but we start talking about the people that are involved, then you begin to get a picture of what it is that you might need to do to get those individuals to a better spot. So what we've been doing is developing various pathway strategies and leveraging partnerships to be able to get folks into better jobs. And as a result, in just the first year, 581 union members enrolled in college, which if you think about that population, it's pretty significant. So just a couple of highlights about how we actually did that work. So we began by making sure that we really understood who the union members were. So we sent a survey to them and we said, well, what is it that you know how to do already? And what is it that you really want to be doing? And we discovered that a lot of them really loved working in the caring sector and wanted to go into a
Mm.
healthcare related field. But another group of them were entrepreneurs and they were ready to start their own businesses. So rather than handing the entire community college curriculum, which is kind of like a phone book, and saying all the things you could do. Like we started out by saying, this is what they would like to do. How can we help them
Mhm.
navigate that catalog to find the things that are relevant? We also made sure that the colleges really understood what the lives were like of the domestic workers. So we clarified for them, what are their typical wages? how few benefits they had access to. In fact, that most of them were accessing public benefits to be able to make ends meet. So there's no expectation that then it's sort of like the sky's the limit, people can do whatever they want. Not only are they living on next to nothing, they are caring for somebody who desperately needs their support to make it through the day. So with that clearly in mind, so that's that who are the people and their skills, we focused on this question of, okay, what are the jobs and the related skills? So what we did is we went through using centers of excellence data and said, well, these are the types of jobs that are aligned with what you're interested in. And we also did an analysis to see whether those jobs were things that did okay during both the Great Recession and the COVID-19 pandemic. So we're looking for really durable jobs because people don't always know what their choices are. So we want to get them a list of things that are aligned with their interests and give them specific information to show this would really be a good thing. And then going back to the points that Rebecca made, we made clear what those jobs were actually like. And in that, we took a nuanced way to look at the value of a job. So one of the things we were hearing from the union members is that they actually were very attracted to medical assisting because they could sit down. So when you're doing primary care, it is a bone achingly tiring occupation because you're lifting people. And so the idea that you could sit in a chair and talk to somebody was actually as important to some of those union members as the salary was. We also said, we're just not going to say, go be a medical assistant. We actually looked at different options and identified employers that paid their workers better so that we could direct them not only to an occupation, but to an employer to make sure that that next step was really going to get them to a better occupation. And if you remember, when we're looking at stackability, sometimes what people will do is they'll end up in a job that pays a similar amount. And we wanted to get them to a better earning. And then the final thing we did is we really talked to the colleges and said, okay, now you know who that individual is and where they're trying to go for the jobs. We were looking at what are those partnerships that are necessary to really help people be successful. So we dug into the fact that a lot of the union members did not speak English fluently. And we said, how are we going to layer English language instruction into things like medical terminology? We made sure that the colleges are really thinking about the trade-offs between short-term programs and longer-term programs. So one of the things we see in the stackability research is that women of color end up in very short-term programs and don't stack. A lot of white and Asian women end up in the better jobs earlier because they're going straight into the longer-term programs. So when you're talking to someone who's over 50, it is an interesting trade-off. Do you want to do the short-term thing right now? Do you have enough time to be able to train for that longer credential? And we also just made sure that they could understand how credit for prior learning could fit into this to accelerate their time to that credential. So this is one of those places where if we can honor what people know, then they can get to a longer credential because they don't have to take every single class to relearn what they already know. So that's how we worked with the UDW. So I'm going to turn it over to Rebecca and she's going to clarify what we did on the healthcare side.
Thank you, Kathy. So our organization, the Education Fund, has been working with the Chancellor's Office on a goal for multi-college, multi-employer regional
The
partnership.
community college
Sorry, yes,
chancellor's
the
office,
community
yeah.
college chancellor's office, sorry.
Uh-huh.
And to build that regional, to really do co-designing around healthcare programs at a regional level, aligning those clinical placements that we talked about earlier, coordinating on shared data, funding, and support systems that result in a sustainable ongoing ecosystem that can advance workers and also strengthen the pipeline, both for the colleges who are suffering from decreasing enrollment and also for employers who need that pipeline into the jobs we talked about earlier. So the partnership has been in development. It also includes a real focus on return on investments for colleges, for employers, and for workers. And steps that we can take immediately include, creating that regional articulation across, even within a district, often the colleges have duplicate or uncoordinated programs. So we're working on that, the clinical placements, and also leveraging SEIU members and college instruction. So this photo is a good example of how that work can come together. We did this project in Bakersfield, at Bakersfield College in Kern County, which is a community college. These are Kern County Hospital CNAs, nursing assistants who completed an LVN program. Their clinical instructor was another union member who was an experienced nurse getting close to retirement, who works with the colleges in clinical instruction. They did all their clinical hours on site at their employers, and now they're in LVN jobs. So really good example of how that can come together. If you go to the next slide. Um, then what we want to do, we're focused right now on the East Bay. We'll also be looking at other regions across the state. But we have 18,000 union members in the East Bay. So we're starting really digging down, understanding their skills, their wage trajectories, the barriers they've had, and designing education that meets them. I mean, when we talked earlier about how do we support people in these, it really is about understanding the individual needs and designing programs that can meet them where they're at and customize a bit to their specific trajectory that they need to get on. So we're working to create new opportunities that allow colleges also to understand the employer concerns. So we've been holding fishbowl meetings, design sessions where
Mhm.
employers and colleges listen to each other, and the union presidents came too. It was really interesting. West Ed facilitated this, and it was a fantastic kind of opportunity for uh, the unions and the employers to listen to what the colleges are dealing with, and then corollary was the colleges in a listening circle outside of the union and the employer talking about the difficulties of pain points of both hiring, supporting members in advancement, but also in being able to work with community colleges. So that was really fantastic. Um, and then we're really focused on measuring the impact, and we do that in very specific ways. We look at wage gains, the reduction in vacancies and turnover for employers, as well as for the colleges. We're looking at their enrollment and the funding sustainability. Part of what we do at the Education Fund is we are a $60 million a year training fund tied to specific employers and their workforce that's in the union through collective bargaining. And so what we're really looking at is how are those dollars best spent in a way that can support and partner with public institutions and colleges and support the regional sustainability of the education pipelines into our industry that ties back to the actual job needs and our patients' need to receive care. So if you go back to the next slide, or go forward to the next slide. Really what we're looking at is regional partnerships that integrate work and learning and are sort of a win-win-win across employers, schools, and our learners. And we also are looking at how both skills and credentials are facilitated and developed through those programs, that they're very high quality in terms of what we offer, and also that learners are really nurtured in a way that promotes their success in the outcomes. So both economic mobility and the changing occupations really necessitate learning through the lifespan. So you can't enter a medical assisting job even anymore, right? And expect that you're going to work for 20, 30 years with no change. And if you are a young worker coming into that job and you're going to have different expenses and costs that you need to be able to advance through your course of your career, you can't just stay in one job and maintain yourself economically, right? Like you need that mobility to support your changing needs of your family. So entry level jobs and, Kathy, you mentioned it, all the lifting. There's a lot of jobs in entry level healthcare that are very physical. And so all of those things mean that we really need to sort of work early with people so they understand what their options are, understand what their plans are so they are able to advance. And if you go to the next slide, um, this is an example in this photo actually of we had medical secretaries. I was laughing at your example of medical secretaries earlier as a high need job because we're seeing it go away, right? Because of a so this was a group, a cohort recently in Stockton, California that we train medical secretary jobs that were being eliminated, and these union members retrained into patient care tech roles. They had a lot of medical terminology knowledge, a lot of the basic skills and understanding of the medical field. And so they were pretty quickly able to do training. We did a 1 week intensive 40-hour classroom training, but it's combined with a 90-day mentorship preceptor experience and also additional on the job training around the electronic medical records that they need. So this is a kind of an example of where that partnership between the union and the employer and the workers had this great outcome. And these medical secretaries are now on a clinical path that could continue to advance through their access to education training benefits with their union and employer. So just to say that training can be designed to support those kinds of transitions, reskilling and upskilling, that advancement opportunities are really critical for employers right now as a retention tool. I think this is beyond healthcare. I think across all of our workforce, workers are really looking for advancement opportunities that will have a lasting impact for them and their families. Workers enter healthcare because they are passionate about caring for people. And I think, a lot of them come in at the entry level, and you really need to design programs around them for them to be able to advance. Our program serves 22,000 learners annually. Like Kathy mentioned with the UDW, majority are women and workers of color. The median and the average age are both 40, so half are above 40, half are above 40. And only 80% have a 4-year college degree. I'm sorry, only 20% have a 4-year college degree. The majority, 80%, have a certificate, maybe an associate's, but more likely a certificate or a license that they've earned. And their workers are motivated, 87% completion, 50% lower turnover for those who participate in the program versus union members who are not participating in the program. And the average wages that they are earning when they place into a new job is $15 an hour, 43% increase when they hire into new roles. So this is just kind of like,
Rebecca,
yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
I'm just going to say, just because we're coming up on the
Oh,
final
sorry.
moments,
Yeah.
this is great. Could you put a link to SIEU in the chat, something that would
Yeah.
give folks a little more of a sense of the quality and range of the work that you're doing?
Yeah.
I did put a report of Kathy's from Wested in the chat a little bit earlier. Is it okay if I finish up, Kathy? Did you have
Yep.
a final remark you
Well,
wanted to
I
make?
have one final slide,
Yeah. Okay.
so I can go through this. Really, what I wanted to do was make sure that we leave with like some really clear takeaways. So, I do think that colleges can be effective in helping people build skills. So you just heard several examples that are specific to the community colleges, but it means that they have to go about the work differently than the way we're talking about it in general. So the first is that the skills have to be the building block. Rather than centering it on the current academic programs, we need to get below that and say, what are the critical skills that are embedded within curriculum and embedded in the knowledge that people already have that you're reconnecting to reflect the shifts in the job market. The second is that colleges cannot expect people to just come when classes are offered. That you heard Rebecca describing accelerated programs, ways that learning can be chunked in ways that fit around work and family responsibilities, and that are much more focused on intensive hands-on learning. And the final thing is just like we can't educate our way out of this. Like if we're not working in partnership with industry, colleges can do everything right and still end up with individuals that are graduating or gaining skills and going into the job market and being unable to translate that knowledge into better earnings. So the partnership part has to be important for how colleges move forward.
Mhm.
So that was
That's
my
great.
final point. Thanks.
Wonderful. Thank you. I was just in Peter Beard from the U.S. Chamber of Commerce Foundation was just speaking here earlier saying uh, um, workforce development is a team sport. Yes, it always has been, and we're in a position where we need to build new teams. And so one way of thinking about what you've heard today is how half empty a lot of glasses are. But it's also the case that there's a great deal of opportunities for new forms of cooperation and organizational design and innovation. Jim Saliba has a great comment in the Q&A that I'm just going to call people's attention to. I'd also challenge you with this link. It turns out it takes a lot of people, like hundreds of thousands of people, to build submarines in the United States, and that China is out investing us on submarine construction by 10 to 1 and shipbuilding by 250 to 1. So this is these issues of workforce preparation are not only economic and civic challenges, they also may be national strategic challenges. And one thing we might all think about is, um, given how powerfully external threats can mobilize massive investments in people, how might it be possible to leverage current anxieties about U.S. Economic and technological supremacy, relative to other nations, to get the kind of coordinated and frankly very substantial investment in people that the fourth industrial revolution is going to require. Thank you both. Please tune in 2 weeks from now to hear from Futures Fellows Andrew Frischman and Doug Peterzak. We're going to be talking about reimagining high school in ways that make sense for our time. We'll post these remarks probably within 24 hours, maybe 36 hours. Stay tuned, come back and see us again. And thanks especially to Kathy and Rebecca. Bye-bye.